But what Blavatsky is saying here is that you have exact astronomy, which looks at the physical aspect of the planets. And then you have astrology, which steps beyond the physical aspect. Similarly, you have physiology, that is about our body, and you have psychology, at least at that time, which was trying to step beyond the body. Psyche is the Greek word that was used frequently for the soul. So originally, psychology was probably more like the study of the soul rather than the study of the brain and the activities of the brain. Now, astrology was used in Europe. We will see that soon. And as the whole of the humanity, or the Western humanity, became more and more materialistic, then astrology began to lose its influence on people. Now, there is this aspect of occult astrology, because Blavatsky will present astrology as a science. Now, evidently, it's not a science as what we know in modern science, because modern science deals with the physical, with what is measurable, with what we can experiment, etc. But Blavatsky proposes that there is a counterpart of science, that is what she called the occult science, in which people who have developed the ability to perceive this hidden aspect of the universe, they also made observations and they measured influences, etc., in the same way that scientists do with physical matter. They do it on non-physical planes. So she says the ancient rishis, and rishi is a word used in India for they are sages. So she says the ancient rishis had, by observation, experiment, and deep occult knowledge, taken account of all conceivable combinations of various causes and determined with mathematical precision, almost to infinitesimal point, their effects. But yet, since the cosmos is infinite, no finite being can ever take cognizance of all the possibilities of nature. At any rate, they cannot be committed to writing. So here what she says is that these rishis could observe the influences of the planets, not only on the physical plane, but on our emotions, minds, etc. And just like scientists, as I said, they could record, measure, experiment, and record all these influences. Now, what she says in the second part of this quote is that the whole cosmos is always operating on everything. And, you know, the amount of influences in any single act of any single person is really infinite, because the whole cosmos is right now influencing us in the way we see things, understand things, how we act, etc. As we will see, we do have free will. This is not to propose a mechanistic view or deterministic view where you are pushed by the cosmos to act in certain ways. But there are influences. And if we don't use our free will, we just do whatever these external influences are pushing us to. But in any case, she says that there are so many influences that it's impossible for anybody to calculate them all because they are really infinite. And even if they could, you cannot write infinite books on all the infinite possibilities. So she says, thus they lay down as the first condition of success in astrology, the need for a pure life, physically, morally, and spiritually, in order to develop the psychic capacities of the astrologer, who could thus see in Akasha the combinations of influences not alluded to in the written works and predict their results. So the occult astrology requires that the astrologer is able to actually see on the inner planes these influences. When an occultist would draw let's say a natal chart, is looking at the connection between the planets, but also is looking at all the influences that may not be represented there. And then if a prediction is to be made, that person, that ideal astrologer, that occultist, would take into consideration whatever influences are right there at the moment that go beyond what has been written down. Because as I mentioned, you cannot write down all possible combinations that are constantly changing for each individual. So obviously, there are very few, if any, astrologers that would be occultists in this way. In the Theosophical view, a person like this would be a person basically that is an enlightened being that would be practicing astrology or using astrology, to help humanity. So this is not really possible today in astrology, and this is why Blavatsky says this is all an occult aspect of astrology that is not really available for humanity as a whole. Now, this doesn't mean that astrology, just because we don't have astrologers that can cognize or perceive all these infinite influences, this doesn't mean that astrology is not useful as we have it today. Blavatsky finishes this fragment saying, we must not at the same time lose sight of the fact that although there are numberless combinations which must be determined by the psychic vision of the astrologer, there are yet very large number of them which have been determined and put on record by the ancient sages. So even though not everything is written, a very large amount of these influences are written down in books. And then she says, it is these cases which baffle us when we find that some astrological calculations prove correct, while others are quite beside the mark. So because there is a large amount of influences that have been written down, if whatever you are studying, the influences that are present there, or the main influences, are the ones that have been described, then your calculations, predictions, interpretations will be right. But in cases where there may be some other influences, then you are missing some information. So what you say may not happen in the way that you as an astrologer was interpreting it. So this is basically a limitation that we have when we work with astrology, which a way to minimize this limitation is by the astrologers following some kind of spiritual life and spiritual practice, so that they begin to awaken their intuition. In the Theosophical view, the intuition is a spiritual sense, not the intuition as a gut feeling, intuition as a perception of things that are beyond our senses, and that somehow we perceive them, even though we are not perceiving them through senses or even through a logical train of thought. So if the astrologer is following a spiritual life, then the intuition in that person is beginning to awaken, and then it can help the astrologer sense where there may be some gaps. Eventually, as humanity continues its evolution, astrology will become more and more accurate, because more and more people will have access to these higher perceptions. Of course, intuition is, because it is in the process of being developed, is not as clear as sensory perception is for us. But eventually, when that faculty is fully awakened, then that perception is even clearer than any perception that we may have with the physical senses. This is how the rishis that Blavatsky mentioned developed astrology. They can perceive all of this in a way that is far more accurate than what scientists can do on the physical plane with their senses and instruments. So this is what Blavatsky says. Astrology is a science as infallible as astronomy itself, with the condition, however, that its interpreters must be equally infallible. And it is this condition, sine qua non, a condition that you cannot avoid, so very difficult of realization, that has always proved a stumbling block in the acceptance of astrology. So during the Middle Ages in the West, after remember Blavatsky said astrology came to the West around 1400 years ago. And during the Middle Ages, astrologers were held in high regard. They were hired by kings, by wealthy people. Every kingdom would have their own astrologers who would try to predict. I guess they were used mainly as a predictive astrology, to predict what was going to happen in the kingdom, in the war, in this, that, to help advise the king. And sometimes the astrologers were right, and sometimes they failed for the reason that Blavatsky explains here. At the time, in the Middle Ages, the failures were accepted or tolerated because in the West, we didn't really understand nature. This was before the development of science. And the whole of nature seemed quite mysterious and obscure. So really, everybody was making guesses whether physicians, or astrologers or whoever, they were all making guesses, and sometimes they were right, sometimes they were wrong. However, with the rise of the scientific revolution, then the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment, the age of reason, the idea of the possibility of accurate knowledge that you could test, that you could have controllable results, all this idea began to take root in our Western society. And then astrologers, little by little, began to lose their credibility, because they were saying, look, in science, we can predict what is going to happen if you shoot a cannon. We know the laws of motion. We can predict where it falls. And yet you cannot predict things with that level of accuracy. So little by little, astrology began to lose credibility during this time. Now, something similar was happening with other sciences, let's say, doctors, because the human body is so complex. Many times doctors were in a similar position. They were, before they started experimenting and developing medicine as a science, they were using the writings of Aristotle and Paracelsus, and many of these writings were really, more symbolic than objective. And many of the things many of the things that Aristotle wrote were not right, were plain wrong. So doctors also many times would get things wrong, and there was a pressure on them to be able to deliver, or otherwise medicine would go the route that astrology went during this time. Eventually, some doctors said, let us abandon all these ancient texts. They are not accurate, and they started experimenting and developing modern medicine, and then medicine became a science. Of course, those ancient texts may have a lot of esoteric knowledge about human physiology and medicine, but the key to interpret this esoterically had been lost in the Middle Ages, so they were not useful any longer. So in any case, the practice of astrology declined in Europe from the 17th century to the 19th century. When Blavatsky was writing, astrology was in its lowest point of influence. And then came a revival of Western modern astrology. Blavatsky wrote about this at the time. She says, astrology has fallen into great neglect during the last 2 centuries. Remember, she was writing in the 19th century. She says, it is a science far more difficult to master than the highest of mathematics. Yet, notwithstanding all, we assert again that whenever studied conscientiously, it proves correct the claims of those who are proficient in it.